these tiny little houses that he lives in.
Good to see you.
Yeah. So I guess we could get started. So I was just in the process of saying that Marco Massi and I have had this exchange for, I don't know, I guess it's the Aurobindo reading of The Life Divine, where we sort of said, well, we're both physicists. It would be nice to do something together. And when the discussion about entanglement came up, I thought, oh, well, maybe this is something I could rope Marco into. And he's kindly agreed to help out with the job, which is not an easy one. So the thing about entanglement, well, we're going to talk about quantum physics, because you kind of have to build entanglement onto an existing understanding of quantum physics. And the Wendt book goes beyond entanglement to talk about how you can bootstrap quantum physics into the realm of social theory, which is quite a big jump. And so the idea today is to revisit entanglement and its relationship with quantum physics mostly. And then we'll see how much time at the end we can sort of bring in the other arguments that Wendt brings into his book, because we can't do that really without doing the first part. And also I'm going to try and avoid lecturing, because it would be easy to give an hour lecture about quantum physics here. I don't think that's the point of the exercise. So what I have is a series of points that I want to make. And what I propose to do is to kind of step through them, but also, you know, allow anybody to say anything about anything. So it'll be a kind of a dance, if you like, between propositions that I put forward and then responses from the group in terms of how to deal with these propositions, right? So I think 23 of these propositions. I don't think we'll get, but I know from past experience with these discussions that even stuff that I don't bring up will come up anyway. So so I don't feel that you know, that I need to spell out all the points on my end. And I'm going to rely on Marco to some extent with the physics, because I'm not a practicing physicist, haven't been for many years, even though I've looked at some of these questions before. But Marco has taught quantum physics, and he's written a book about quantum physics for helping people to understand it. So I think in some ways he's a more qualified person to talk about the physics. And of course, Marco is also thought quite deeply about the relationship between the physics and spiritual issues and other aspects of our common interest in these areas. So I don't know if you have any reactions to that kind of an approach. Does it sound reasonable? Okay, so the first thing I wanted to make clear is that we're basically talking about, so the reason why everybody can really get the basics of entanglement is it's really a series of experiments. And what are experiments? They're a set of configurations, a set of measurements. So there's descriptions of the configurations, descriptions of the measurements, and then some description about the analysis of the results of these measurements. And basically, that's what we're talking about with the, hi, Michael. We're just starting, Michael, so you haven't really missed anything.
Wow, that's great. I thought I was on a late bus to get here.
So, so there are three experiments, essentially, that are the sort of nucleus of this issue about entanglement. The first experiment is an experiment that's very, very classical. It goes back to the very beginnings of quantum physics. It's called the two-slit experiment. And it's a very simple idea. You could test it in your own homes. You need a laser in order to do it, but you can buy a laser pointer that will do the job. Lasers in the old days used to cost thousands of dollars, but these days you can buy a little gadget that does it for you. Set up two slits and set up a screen behind it and shine the laser through the two slits. And you can see these effects directly yourselves. So the basic two-slit experiment. So the two-slit experiment, just to remind you, if you have one slit, you get a straight Gaussian kind of pattern behind of intensity, where it gets more and more intense and then less and less intense behind on the screen behind where the light is going through the slit. But if you put a second slit in, you don't get two patterns like you might expect. You get instead an interference pattern. And normally it's an interference pattern that is simply, it's a bouncing pattern all across the back of the screen. It's not one that gets brighter and dimmer. It just gets brighter, dimmer, brighter, dimmer, brighter, dimmer, brighter, all the way across. And this is a property of waves. So you can do it also. When I was a high school student, we did the experiment looking at that waves on water. So you have a water tank and you have a bar and you set up the waves on the bar, and then you have a barrier with openings in the barrier. And you can do the same experiment in that context. And then you see the interference effects on the back screen as the waves propagate across. So it's a wave experiment, essentially, the two-slit experiment. Where it starts to get interesting is, this is not so easy to do in your home. It's to slow down the number of photons that move through the slits. So only one goes through the slit at a time. And because photons are a kind of particle, right? Now, the funny thing about when that happens is the photon, even though it's only one going through the slit at a time, it acts as if it were a particle. It's like it is aware in some sense of the existence of the other slit. And its path is modified as a result. If you close off the other slit, the pattern is, the photon doesn't go to the same place, or doesn't appear to go to the same place. So it has these odd effects. So that's the basic double slit experiment. The second experiment is the entangled double slit experiment, where it's not exactly a double slit, but it's often done as a double slit experiment. It's an entangled experiment. So it's this idea that you have two particles. Marco, do you want to try and explain this one? You're muted.
Yeah, I have already some slides. As you say, I don't want to lecture. Don't panic. But I had already some slides that maybe can help you to visualize what Geoffrey already said. And I tried to share the screen. And where is the sharing now? Ah, okay. This one here. Do you see something?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay. So the thing that Geoffrey was hinting at, here we have the two slits. This is just a GIF image. Here we have a plane wave, which goes through the slits, and through a diffraction effect, you know, you have these circular waves which come out from the single slits. You can also just imagine it as a water wave that hits on a screen with two pinholes, if you wish. And these two circular waves interfere with each other, which means that you have two waves, you know, that they have a maximum and minimum. And when they overlap, they subtract or add up each other, which means you have a constructive or destructive interference. And what you have at the end of the screen here is such an image, where here you have where the black part is the destructive interference, the white dots, you have the constructive interference. And this is a pretty normal wave effect that you have also in classical mechanics. If you do the same thing, not with just a lot of light, with a laser light, but with a single photon, okay, this here is a graph that shows the up and downs, maxima, minima, that we also already hinted at. If you have a classical understanding of how particles are, you imagine them going through one or the other slit, which means that you expect to have a spot here or a spot here. If you take one photon at a time, you will have first, with few photons, you will have a random, seemingly a random pattern. But if you wait more time, you see many photons. These are only single photons. You let go through one photon at a time only. And at the end, if you wait a sufficient long time, you get again the interference fringes, which are the same stuff that we had here. And that's what the wave-particle duality is about. And okay, I think maybe.
So then just the entanglement issue, right? So just to get to the next step.
Yes, the entanglement issue, I used to go from the photon to the particles with the spin. Imagine two particles having a spin, which means that they rotate clockwise or anti-clockwise. And just imagine that they interact somehow and then they spread out, or they are produced from a source. There can be special conditions where you can produce particles where they are anti-correlated, which means that every time that you measure the spin, that is the rotation of the angular momentum, so-called intrinsic angular momentum of one particle, you can be sure that the other particle has the opposite spin. For example, if you take two electrons which are entangled, this means that even if these two electrons are light years, maybe I switch now to my, or I can show also here. You can see here spin of quantum particles. You one spin or the other spin, and if they are entangled, this means that if you measure one particle, or in this case an electron, you can be sure that the other electron has the opposite spin, the opposite angular momentum. If you wish, you can imagine it as the speed of rotation of a particle, even though this is a very classical understanding. It's not a quantum understanding. The fact that they are entangled means, however, not just like tossing two coins, and you know that one coin is heat and the other is tail. Entanglement in quantum physics means that the measurement of one of the electrons immediately, instantly, also if the other electron is light years away, determines the spin, the opposite spin of the other electron. And this is an experiment that can be done with photons or electrons or whatever kind of particle. So the important point I think that we must distinguish is the classical understanding and the quantum understanding. The classical understanding imagines that we don't know which particle is in which spin state, and we just discover it by measuring one particle, and then we know that the other particle has the opposite spin. In quantum mechanics, there is this understanding that tells us that this is a wrong interpretation, and the entanglement means that the measurement, only at the time of measurement, which of the two particles has which spin is determined, not previously. And this also at great distances. So there is this sort of what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. So I don't know, maybe I open to the question.
The point that Marco is saying is that before the measurement, the particles are in superimposed states. They are in several states at the same time, like the Schrödinger's cat. That's why I said, if you understand the Schrödinger, or you at least are familiar with the Schrödinger cat, you can understand this. Before the measurement, the particles are both spin up and both spin down, but they're correlated as well. So internally, if you like, and so that when you measure them, that's when they flip into the positive down or the positive up, with the alternate, the other being the alternative. So this is getting into the issue of interpretations of quantum mechanics, because that is an interpretation. The measurements are the same, whether you believe them classically or quantumly, in the way that Marco described. But it's the interpretation that differs. Now, between classical and quantum, you can show that the classical is not correct and that the quantum is correct. But there are many different interpretations in the quantum realm. And the problem with the different interpretations, I think Wendt in his book describes 6 different interpretations, but he actually means classes of interpretations rather than individual interpretations, because there are hundreds of interpretations. But the problem is they all predict the same measurements. You can't distinguish between the interpretations by measuring things. You can only distinguish between them by some other argument. It might be metaphysical, it might be personal preference, you know, it might be because the interpretation is tied to another theory. So you can make sense to some extent, distinguish these different interpretations, but you can't do it through measurements. So the typical examples are the Copenhagen interpretation, which is the one that Marco just described, where the two particles are both in the up, both in the down, and they fix into one or the other based on the measurement, which is the idea that there's all of the quantum theories assume there's a wave function. So the particles are bound by a wave function, and the wave function collapses when you make the measurement, so that it becomes one of the possibilities that the wave function allows. And it becomes it randomly. Whether it goes up or whether it goes down is a purely random result. So it's got this odd combination of determinism, because the wave function is deterministic, but the actual measurements and the results of the measurement are random. And so you've got these two things going on. And this is important because there are other consequences of the entanglement problem where this really comes into effect. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But the other thing I wanted to say about this So these different interpretations, the other main one that most of us have heard about is the many worlds interpretation, which is the idea that the universe splits into two different universes each time a measurement is made, or into multiple universe each time a measure is made. And in that case, there is no collapse of the weight function. It's simply that the universe splits in these different things. And the many worlds interpretation, as I said earlier, is perfectly consistent with all the measurements we have, just like the Copenhagen interpretation is consistent. It's just that they assume very different things about the universe in order to get there, which is part of the tricky thing about untangling all of these, all these different theoretical issues. So those are the first two experiments. The third one, which I don't know, it's a complication on the first two. The one that Marco explained is a problem of entanglement in space. As to say, you have one particle with one spin in one location and the opposite spin in another location, and they're widely separated in space. The third experiment, and it was in the material that I had you look at, if you had the time to look at it, is called the delayed choice experiment. And what it means is, instead of only looking at one particle and another one separated in space, you set the experiment up in such a way that the particle you look at is in the future of the particle that's entangled. And so you can actually affect the entangled particle at a different time than the one you measure. So you measure one, and the other is automatically in the opposite position, but it can be set up so that the opposite position is actually an earlier time. And this is also, it kind of follows from the one, but it's an odd result. Now, it's proved. So this is the thing about entanglement. People worry about these are theories and therefore they're not likely to be, but these things are proved in the way that all of the main canon physics is proved. Nobody questions these experiments, these issues. It's the interpretations they question, but not the experiments themselves. So entanglement is a fact of the universe. This is known. It's spatially entangled and temporally entangled. This is known. What we do with it is a very different question, and there are issues that need to be teased out of that. Anyway, maybe it would be a good time to get questions, because I'm sure there are. Before going forward.
I have arrived a couple of minutes late, so I guess one of the questions I have is who else is on the call and what interests in this topic area brought you to this particular session?
You're right, Blake. That was mea culpa for that, because the rest of us kind of know each other. But,
oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm an interloper then.
Yeah. But I think we could certainly do a quick go around. I think that would be perfectly appropriate.
All right. That would be great. I would enjoy that. Maybe I can just start off then. I'm in the School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and much of my work involves community resilience and societal transformation, like transformative social change in terms of sustainability transitions. And I've become interested in quantum social science of late because I think it actually gives us an opportunity to completely reimagine environmentalism as we currently understand it. And So I'm kind of working through the implications of what that might mean at the same time as getting up to speed on all of this stuff. But I find it quite intriguing and exciting. So I presented something in Detroit at the Planetary Health Conference in May that basically argued kind of a 3-point kind of moving forward for thinking about planetary health was to base it around decolonization of the dominant hegemonic ways of thinking and doing, embracing a relational worldview, and then stepping into, you know, a quantum understanding of social change. And I think they dovetail actually quite nicely together. But anyway, just that's a very brief and perhaps cryptic introduction to my interest in this stuff. Love to hear from others.
Well, Blake, welcome. All of us know each other pretty well. We have very different backgrounds here. I have a theater background. Heather works in academia. She's into rhetoric. It's, I think, her actual field of study. Ed is you're a retired teacher, I think, an English teacher, and he's in Germany. Michael is, I'm doing everyone an introduction here. I'm not wanting to replace anything you might want to say personally, but just to move this along very quickly. And Ed also works in Silicon Valley, and Michael is our physical therapist guy. He's an expert in trauma and how to go beyond trauma. And Marco's a physicist, and Jeffrey's a physicist, and both of them are working in education. And we're just sort of a collective, and our identities are constantly shifting and moving very kaleidoscopically. And I'll just throw out I have a lot of questions here, but I want to postpone that and give other people a chance to, you know, identify or re-identify themselves or correct my misunderstandings, because I'm sure there are multiple agendas here that want to get expressed. So, but I did want to focus my attention on some specifics.
Yeah, so Heather, did you want to go?
Either one, Michael, if you want to go first.
You go ahead and go, Heather.
All right, I was just going to say that thank you, Johnny, for pointing out the rhetoric part. That was the first part of my professional development, and then I went back and got an MFA. So creative writing is really where I connect with this topic more closely. And Jeffrey and Marco Morelli and I did a collaborative presentation at the Gebser Society conference last year on quantum field poetics, and it remains an interest. I was just going to say that one of my favorite musical groups, Bon Iver, who has a 4th album coming out, recently visited the Hadron Collider. And I was just thinking about, and I recommended to them, not that they got the recommendation, but some of the quantum poetic stuff. I'm just seeing some potential synergies through language and the arts. Yet I have a really hard time wrapping my brain around it. And this was a deep dive for me this morning or this afternoon. So I don't quite follow everything that's been said. I have more of an experiential way of connecting with things like entanglement. So I'm curious, my question, and then others can jump in to share their point of connection. My question is, why are the two of you presenting on this today? So I'm curious to know what prompted this presentation.
And I guess I am the resident trauma California dude that kind of just jumps in with both feet because I like deep dives, and I just come from a very experiential 60s kind of let's love the world into existence, I guess, might be a way to say it.
That was a good one, Michael. The only thing I would to add to what John had said, he's absolutely right. I'm anything that has to do with the mind or consciousness or why we're even on this planet interests me. And so I'm one of the regulars here in our Tuesday night cafes, because that's basically that's the bush we beat around all the time. So I wouldn't want to miss this one for anything.
Well, I just add that I am also a retired teacher in Germany. So to distinguish us from each other, I don't know, just say, okay, you are a retired professor and I am a retired teacher, but physicist. And my interest was more to know here, in this case, why people are interested in quantum mechanics. Because I'm interested, I must say, initially and also until today, I'm more interested from the physical point of view. From the social and spiritual point of view, I'm very sympathetic to this, because as everyone knows here, I'm our Bindonian. I read with you the Life Divine, and we are going on now with the sessions on Savitri and so on. So I have some, how can I say, a mystical vein, so to speak. But in me, there is always this conflict with also the rational scientist. And I must say, when I hear about the connections between quantum physics and spirituality, and mind and matter, the brain, and social sciences, and so on, I believe that there is something like that, but I don't think that what has been said so far is very consistent for me, at least. I'm a skeptical and a believer at the same time. I'm entangled in this sense, in a superposition state, no, superposition of states where I'm a skeptic and at the same time a believer that quantum mechanics, in fact, determines, for example, let's make the example, our brain functions. But if you ask me for a concrete and hard proof, scientific proof of that, I would say, no, we are still not there. These are mostly speculations. And it is somehow surprising for me that there are so many people who are interested into the subject, but are usually, there are, of course, a lot of exceptions. We will eventually talk about them, but usually they are not physicists. And I believe there is a background intuition of people who think intuitively and feel that there is this connection. Whereas on the other side, there is a scientific community that thinks only very rationally and has lost this contact with the intuition and does not see this connection. So there is this dichotomy in our society that is, I find fascinating, and that's why I like to participate at these sessions.
Marco Morelli, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I'll just say hi. I can't stay past the top of the hour, but I'm also Marco, but Marco Morelli, and I'm a writer, a poet, one of the instigators of these dialogues. I come at this more from a literary angle. I find the ideas fascinating. I'm interested in what the nature of the universe is. And as an artist, I'm particularly interested in consciousness. And so quantum physics seems to be the interface between, or at least theoretically or speculatively, the interface between physics, or the hard sciences, and consciousness. I'm curious about that connection, and if you might touch on it later. I won't get to be present for the second half of this, but I will certainly listen to it or watch it when I have the opportunity. So thank you so much for presenting, Jeffrey and Marco. And nice to meet you, Blake. And nice to see you, Heather, and John, and Ed, and Michael. And I hope I didn't miss anybody.
Okay, so maybe just to come back with, I think the same question was asked by Heather and Marco, Mazi, and maybe some other people. Why am I doing this? Or I guess that was, why were we doing this? But I mean, it's a difficult question for me to answer, right? Because, I mean, I would say I bid for Marco, same thing, skeptical, to some extent and a believer in other ways. But I've been looking at quantum physics and the relationships beyond the physical realm for more than 30 years. You know, the quantum poetics work came out of the work that I did 30 years ago. And reading the Wendt book, I discovered that there's a whole bunch of research that was done in the last 20 years that reproduces stuff that I did 30 years ago, but never published on, to my regret. But anyway, so, I mean, I think these connections go deeper than physicists would like to admit for the most part. We all know there are big problems with the materialist, physicalist kind of framework for science that is currently the main framework. And these quantum issues interestingly cut across those problems in ways that I think are compelling, even though the actual details as laid out are still questionable, right? So this is coming back to Marco's argument that maybe the science isn't quite there yet. But there seems to be something deeper going on for me, and this is what I'm struggling and to make sense of in all the, you know, I'm kind of an integrationist. I like things to make sense across domains, even though that's a challenge. And so this is part of that effort, right? So in terms of, so I don't know if that answers your question, Blake. I should mention that Blake and I collaborated about 10 years ago together. We actually were co-funded together on a project.
That's right.
Yeah,
no, go ahead.
Yeah, and so so we have this long background together, but we've been out of touch for years. So this is actually a kind of a nice opportunity for us to reconnect. And the reason we reconnected is I think we're friends on Facebook, and I said, or he said he was reading Quantum Mind and Social Science, and I said, oh, I'm reading that too. So this is where the connection.
That's right. Yeah.
And the book was suggested to me by Johnny. So we're all entangled here, right?
Right.
I would say, so let me see. Johnny, you had some particular questions. Maybe do you want to come back?
Well, I'll jump into this because it's a little, I need to give you a little bit of background before I think the questions, which are sort of comparativist kind of questions, could make some sense. Just very briefly, I think you've done a great job of helping us understand some of the complexity involved as we move from a transition from a classical to a quantum worldview. And I think this is what I think Wendt's book is about, talking about quantum mind, is that a lot of the presuppositions of the classical world, classical Newtonian worldview, are still in the background of people's thinking, and they haven't let it go to enter into a quantum worldview, which would clarify, he believes, some of our social quandaries that we find ourselves in. And I believe the whole idea of looking at genetics, the history of genetics and the history of physics. I'm an expert in neither, but I read a lot. I'm listening to an author, Evelyn Fox Keller. She's a feminist. She writes a lot about ecology and science. She's a science writer. She's talking about the history of genetics. We moved from Mendel, the turn of the century, last century, Crick and Watson in the middle of the century, then the Human Genome Project, which ended around 2000, I believe. And we're still learning more and more and more about the presuppositions of what a gene has been challenged and deconstructed. So the genetics, the genes, are not what they are. I mean, when I grew up, when I was studying the biology that I studied, it's totally has been deconstructed. So if the gene comes with a lot of baggage, she says, she's not saying we should throw away that baggage that the gene comes with, because it teaches us a lot about the culture of biology. And I wonder if there's an analogy here between the culture of physics and the history of this this particle wave conundrum, which sort of started at the same time, I guess, at the turn of the last century, and into the 30s and ongoing after the atomic bomb. So I, as a non-scientist, come to these events with lots of questions, probably extremely naive, because I'm living in a world that is dominated by science. And lots of experiments, which I don't understand, are being used by, I believe, very narrow-minded folks to dominate in this kind of a planetary way that we're sort of evolving this. The differences between a neoliberal vision and which is driven by corporations and a planetary vision. I think these are the kinds of questions that would interest me as a citizen who's trying to make sense of a world which is not making a lot of sense right now. So I'm just bringing that to the table. Is there a relationship between the culture of physics and the culture of biology, with these controversies about what a gene is and the material chemical nature of the gene, which is extremely weird. It's getting weirder every day that we're starting to realize that the gene is both a chemical and information. And the particle wave dilemma. And so, and the baggage surround that, and how we shouldn't even try to throw out that baggage, because I think the culture rides upon all that stuff. So, and is there a relationship between the physics of culture and the culture of literature? And since none of us is an island, and we probably have our foot in many different camps, I think I would just open that up. Hopefully that triggers some curiosity and interest in the group. And once again, this is probably a very naive question, probably a little too large. I'm trying to chunk it down. So thank you.
I was just going to say, but I'll let Marco speak too. So you talk about the wave particle conundrum. So, I mean, there is no conundrum in a way, right? I mean, I agree with you about the culture issues, and I do think these things are linked, but they are not linked in the sense, I don't think they are linked in the sense of the wave particle duality, which is a built-in property of the universe, for which there is no argument, right? You know, neoliberal versus more progressive is an argument. It's not a built-in function in the same way. So I just a little bit hesitant to put those two things together in the way that you have proposed to do.
Well, perhaps there's a different, we may be talking about different kinds of facts. We're moving from the culture of physics to the culture of sociology or literature. So I think the facts that you say are agreed upon, but the interpretations vary considerably. What's in the in-between the facts, which are agreed upon, and the very interpretations? And is that social in nature? That's my sort of meta question. I hope that makes some sense.
Marco, do you want to have a go at it?
Yes, because I'm glad, John, that you took up this example of the Human Genome Project, which I'm not a biologist, and I don't know all the details, I'm not an expert in this, but I have read a lot of times that this concept of the gene is no longer the same concept that we had even only, I think, 10 years ago. It has transformed completely this idea what the gene is and what it makes is completely different now in our understanding than what it was only recently. And I think there are a lot of parallels with physics, also with this. The first thing that comes to my mind is the concept that we had of the atom, Bohr's atom, where you have an electron orbiting on very precise, indefinite orbits, and everything was, in a certain sense, still classical, even if these orbits could only be discrete orbits and quantized orbits, but it was more or less almost a classical concept. And it is still today, they teach it in schools. Whereas this concept is completely false. It is historically very interesting, and at that time it made sense to a certain point, but it explains almost nothing. It explains only a hydrogen atom and nothing more. And there is still also a lot of things that you spoke, for example, of letting go the classical view. This resistance of letting go the classical view, I see that personally, I find this a lot also among physicists. And this idea that at the bottom, everything must return to become again, if not Newtonian, let's call it deterministic and precise and reductionistic. Everything is reductionistic and deterministic. They hope for, but nature resists this idea, and every time it gives us more and more food to think about, and that it contradicts this idea. Nowadays, Geoffrey mentioned the many world interpretations. There are also other interpretations like the de Broglie-Bohm pilot wave theory, which is also a sort of deterministic, almost classical understanding of quantum physics, with the exception that it is non-local. You have to give up non-locality in any case. But apart from that, it is still a world determined by particles, point-like particles, which have a precise, indefinite, and deterministic paths and trajectories, and they hit each other like billiard balls. And so, in a certain sense, you cannot contradict these theories, these interpretations, because, well, at the end, they are able to recast reality in a new theory and to bring back, if not all, but a good amount of our classical understanding of the world. So these are called interpretations because, you know, there are so many physicists, so many interpretations as there are physicists. So personally, I don't have a good feeling with these interpretations because I see these interpretations, as, at least these two last interpretations that I cited now, as a sort of attempt to recover and to return back to an almost classical view of the physical realm. And that's something that and as I say, I don't want to speak too much about that, but I find this idea, this resistance to change the worldview from a classical worldview to another type of worldview, also among biologists. And I have read, by the way, I don't know if how much this is correct, but the Genome Project showed very well how having the map of the territory does not explain what this territory is. Now, we have mapped everything, but many questions remain unanswered. And I can say, yes, there are many parallels also, especially in quantum physics, that you can like this.
Thank you, Marco. That was very helpful.
The gene project is interesting because the way it shifted was in the old days, one thought that genes decided everything. And there were people saying no all along, but they weren't necessarily listened to very much. This whole problem of paradigms in science. The paradigm was that genes are deterministic, and that's essentially what's going on. And this counter paradigm started to stick its nose up and say, there's all sorts of other things going on. So it's the way genes get expressed, and the same gene can be expressed in many different ways. And this is where you started to get all the variety. So it stopped being this simple separability of the genes in terms of function, the way the original idea was. And it went back to something that's much messier and much closer to this kind of inseparability that we talk about through in the question of entanglement. So again, I think indeed in some ways, the discussion on quantum biology is a re-picking up some of these arguments and applying them in the area of biology. So these ideas of entanglement are also seem to be built into the biological point of view. But one of the difficulties I have with Wendt's argument is that his idea, although I find it very seductive, his idea is that but he uses I'll come back to it in a moment. He uses a variant on the Bohm interpretation, and I have the same difficulties that Marco Massi has about both the many worlds and the Bohm interpretations. I think they're kind of an attempt to pull back from the full quantum approach. But so the variant on the theory, on the interpretation that Wendt picks up on, is this idea that, okay, great, Heather, great to have you. Hope to see you again soon. So it's this idea that, so Wendt has this idea that consciousness, that the quantum effects are in the brain, that the wave collapse is what he calls essentially consciousness, and that when the wave collapses, two time moving functions or operations are created. A wave that moves forward in time, which is called retarded, and a wave that moves backward in time, which is called advanced. And the wave that moves forward is the causality wave, and the wave that moves backwards is the mental wave. But this is all based on pilot wave theory, which is the Bohm interpretation, which has real, so even though he talks about collapse of the wave function and these things, he's not quite talking about them in the classical quantum way. And so again, my personal, I guess, I don't know whether it's personal preference is not to go for the Bohm approach, even though the Bohm approach has always had this mentality component to it. Even in Bohm's original conception, he saw this as a kind of mentalism in his interpretation, but it doesn't feel right to me. But that's a kind of a gut thing, just like the many worlds doesn't feel right. So even though I like Wendt's arguments, I don't know to what extent one can pull out of them the Bohm interpretation as opposed to a different one and still get quantum consciousness the way that he's talking about it. I think probably the theory is not correct, although it's not really a theory yet. It's just a set of ideas, right? So I'm not quite sure whether that helps anybody.
Well, that helps me, Jeffrey. It helps me insofar as I think among those of us who are non-physicists, we're not scientists. I was an English teacher. I worked as an engineer. I did technical. I've done 1,000 things, and nothing has to do with anything, but everything has to do with everything at the same time. And And when you're trying to figure out, you know, like, it's like you said, well, you know, what's the nature of reality, and how is it that we function, and how is the universe at work? If you start thinking about that, it gets very messy very quickly, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed. And I think a lot of lay people that go into this hear interpretations, and that's what I really liked about what you had said. There are an enormous number of interpretations that all support the facts that are given. And what we don't do enough, I think, in schools is to show, and this applies to literature, this links back to what John said. We can all read a piece, whatever it is. It could be a poem, it can be a novel, we could watch a play, or we could read the play, and we can all think it means something different. And everyone uses the piece of literature to justify their view. And they're all right in a way, and they're all wrong in a way, and they're all not quite the whole story. But we tend, because of where we are, I think, evolutionarily and consciously, we tend to think that the one that we agree with is the right one. And being open to the fact that it could be the wrong one is a difficult thing to do. This is what I hear when Markham talks about a lot of physicists would just love to revert, if they could, to a classical mechanical kind of deterministic understanding because they feel more comfortable with it. We have a discomfort with things we're not so sure about. And we tend to place emphasis on the one that we like and think, well, that's the way it is. And so it makes the discussion very difficult. That's why I really appreciate when folks like you and Marco, they go, well, I understand what they're saying, but it just doesn't feel right. You know, I'm with you on that one. I hear this and I'm going, I don't know. It seems like a pretty big axe to have the universe split every time something gets decided. You know, it's just like, you really need to go to all that work kind of thing. You know, isn't there a simpler way to do it, for example? But being aware of and being reminded of that is at the moment just it's an interpretation of how we think the fact. And we need to keep thinking about things, because the thing that's always motivated me in all of this is whenever I encounter a thought, I try to think the thought through to the end. Now, it usually I don't ever get to the end of it. And it usually ends up getting very, very nebulous and very cloudy, because you run into, you know, when you're pursuing that, how that thought plays out, there's just too many things that pop up that you can't know, and you don't know. We don't know yet. And it might come later, which is the interesting part of the history. We all thought we knew what a gene was, and now we think it is something else. We just don't think it's something else. It is something else, and so that changes. And when we can appreciate following through on that concept that it's changing, then for me, I get a certain amount of surety and security out of that, knowing, okay, it's a lot fuzzy now, it's a less fuzzy later, and it's going to get more fuzzy thereafter, but I've already gone through this fuzziness. So for me, that was the whole idea with this entanglement thing. If every single photon, particle, electron, whatever that is in some way entangled, what the hell does that mean in the end? You know, what is the real consequence of that thought? And this whole idea of interconnectivity and that we're all kind of related or affected or whatever that is, takes on a very existential meaning. And then I start realizing, well, I can think that I'm a lot different than the raccoon that we got back in the backyard here that keeps bugging everybody. But we're not. And I have a different relationship to the raccoon than I certainly would have had growing up in Western Pennsylvania 50 years ago, kind of thing. So, you know, I think it's, and this is the part that I find helpful, is that we can get together and talk about this in reasonable ways that help us all deal with this multiplicity of explanation, knowing full well none of them is the end story at the present time. You know, that's the value added for me right there.
I just wanted to add something briefly to that, Ed, because you mentioned meaning. And the search, the reductivism in both biology and physics have been the search for the smallest unit of meaning. And when we get there, we can all break out the champagne. But I think we are all very premature, and maybe a lot of us are suffering from a hangover because that effort seems to have stalled or gotten stuck in a very big way. And I think physics and biology have suffered, from this because we got stuck in the arrested development of some extremely smart people. And I think that now we're starting to catch up, and people are starting to let go of the classical and the classical view, classical Newtonian, and also the Crick and Watson top-down model of the genetic code. We're starting to realize epigenetics has a huge influence on how the genes get expressed. So I just have bigger, but I think we can be forgiven, those of us who are not physicists, when we go to conferences or look at conferences where the experts are debating about these various interpretations of the facts, that this looks a whole lot like lit theory to me. Because when I go to a lit theory class or a lit theory conference, they're talking the same way. And that's where I believe there's some hope, because we can start to realize, okay, maybe we can create something that's a little more coherent, as we are all meaning makers as humans. This is a drive I believe we all share, and we can't make much meaning if we don't make much sense. And I believe this is a creative tension that many of us are holding, because it inevitably creates areas of fuzziness and ambiguity, which, we don't like. We like it to be clear and simple, but it's getting more and more ambiguous, and hopefully we can start to embrace that ambiguity and not be frightened of it. I think and I think there's a lot of pressure upon us to be much more flexible than we've ever had to be before. I think we're all getting a very big download right now. Thank you.
Okay, so here comes the trauma guy. Because when I hear the word entangled, in my trauma body, I feel a knottedness, and a lack of openness, not necessarily unknotted, but a lack of openness. And it was once said about, Alexander the Great, he didn't solve the knot, he just fucking cut it. Well, how's that work? You find you don't really work with the tension that John's talking about, or, what I feel, the tension. I actually sense this conversation in terms of a sensation that I think, for all the well and good of biology and physics, I feel that it's all about trying not to really embrace that tension and let it speak to you, rather than try to contain it, resolve it. I spent many years in chronic tense pain, and the only way I solved it was actually sitting with the sensation, because I have a trouble with both biology and physicists not honoring the just very raw human sensation of, I'm fucking alive. What's that about? I don't know what that's about. And yet the history of mankind has all these interpretations, which I don't see any of these interpretations as wrong. They're just different than me, and I want to be open, but at the same time, some interpretations on a sensation level, I agree with Jeffrey and stuff, they don't feel right. They don't land on me right, but I want to not make it necessarily a contracted judgment. They're wrong. They're different enough that I don't want to play ball with you. That interpretation or that style of understanding life doesn't, to use our classic words on here, vibe with me. But what I like, what I'm hearing, and when my sensation is open is all of us being honest about, you know, there's something to diving deep into this being a human being alive. So thank you.
So thank you. One of the interesting things about, so I do think you can untangle some of Wendt's arguments, despite the fact that he's built in the Bohm interpretation of quantum mechanics. The sort of last part of his book, and much of the book is dealing with experiments in quantum biology, experiments in social theory, experiments in linguistics. These are again, you know, the basic stuff that everybody can agree on in terms of the experiments, right? And the last part of his books, he's reflecting on assuming quantum consciousness is present, regardless of how it got there or what the mechanism, the particular details of the quantum mechanism is. Let's look at some things that might come out of it. And he's drawing on these experiments in linguistics and social science and so forth. He has some very interesting things to say about meaning. So in a way, in a quantum way, it looks like the discussions we had in the Bateson group on context, in the way Nora and Gregory talk about context. So in their argument, context is all. And if you don't get the context, you miss the boat. And they're talking about ecologically, you know, with the human mind and the way we're imbricated in societies as being an ecological argument. Wendt's argument is not ecological in that sense. It's quantum, but it arrives at some of the same conclusions. So it arrives at this idea that if you take a quantum approach to language, for instance, that you end up with that it's the quantum connectiveness of things, the entanglement, if you like, but it's not just entanglement he's talking about some other things as well, that gives this idea of meaning, and I think one of the interesting things, and it took me a long time to work this out in Wendt's book, because he doesn't actually state it. He kind of talks around it. There's this idea, so it's this idea of subject versus object, which is called into question by the quantum phenomenon, right? In particular, the entanglement issues raises issues about subjectivity and objectivity. And the argument that's inside Wendt is that there's a kind of an interiority to the way experiences are felt. So the notion that we feel something that's distinct from the objective external regard or the way of looking at this, right? So there's an interiority and an exteriority. And essentially, Wendt argues, and he's not the only one obviously who does this, is that the interiority is built into the universe from the bottom up. The reason we feel things is because, even at a very primitive level, everything feels something. And he argues that when there are memory systems that are in play, these feelings become enhanced, and that's what you get. That's where you get life and consciousness and these things out of it. So it's this interiority that matters, and I think the entanglement, entanglement doesn't force you to conclude that there is interiority, but it's consistent with the idea of interior versus exterior experience. And so, whereas modern materialist approaches to mind are inconsistent with the notion of interiority. All they can talk about are brains. They can't tell us anything about the interior subjective experience. The materialist approach has completely failed on that regard. The strongest arguments that we have are arguments like Dennett, who says there is no interiority. None at all. It's all an illusion. Doesn't seem like a very satisfactory approach, but it's certainly one that some scientists hold. Blake, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I find all of this fascinating. Just circling back around to what you just said, and also what Michael said earlier about feeling. I guess the 2 points that were coming to me, one is that this kind of notion of contraction as a response to something, especially ideas that might threaten our kind of sense of safety or security that's associated with a predictive being, you know, the world being predictable and being able to control things, which is a fiction that the dominant paradigm has lived under for a long time, and which is starting to be undone by the ecological and other consequences of that paradigm. But that movement of contraction is a very interesting one to think about in the context of what we've been discussing, and in terms also of how so many aspects of the classical view continue to not just limp along, but actually run the world in very significant ways. I think of my own disciplinary area of public health, where really the dominant modus operandi is risk management, and it's all predicated on a very classical view of predict and control. But I'm also was intrigued by your comments, Jeffrey, about interiority, because I think if we push on a quantum understanding, actually the distinction between inner and outer collapses. And I think this has very interesting implications for social change work, because the quality of being, and not just the doing, because our society puts an emphasis on what we do and not how we are in the world, the quality of being that we bring to our doing is actually arguably more important than the actual doing. And we have many examples in our daily lives where where they're coming from when they say the same thing has a huge implication for the impacts of whatever they're saying or doing. So I find that all quite interesting too, because then what we were referring to earlier as the mystical or spiritual elements of all of this actually fold in to the core of what we're talking about in ways that indigenous cultures have been arguing for millennia, right? That it's all our relations and everything is interconnected, and how we are in the world has profound implications. How we honor our ancestors, how we are in dialogue with nature, etc. And I think part of the problems, just to wrap up my argument, swirling around a lot of this, and this relates to what Michael was saying, is that we're a society that's kind of, for the most part, the dominant modus operandi is we've gone into our heads, we intellectualize, and we've kind of shut down a lot of the feelings. We've numbed. And so we've lost the immediacy of that feeling of relationality. And so I'm intrigued also by how quantum understandings actually bring us back to some of that in a funny way. They really seem to dovetail with a lot of what indigenous cultures and others are telling us, including some of the, Peter Levine and some of the other trauma therapists that I've read who kind of argue about the need to recover our capacity to feel. Anyway, so that's going maybe a number of directions.
I just want to add in everything you said, Blake, add into, from my point of view, is that like you sorted out the intellectual and we're not, I think a lot of people, if you're sticking with the intellectual, you feel if you drop in your body, you leave the intellect behind. Mm-hmm. That's a falsehood.
Yeah.
What happens is from my experience with trauma and working with actually befriending the contraction and learning with an intellect that is helping me, is more of a friend than a control freak. if that makes sense, then you bring more wholeness, is the operating word that I had to use for recovery, wholeness to my experience of healing through trauma. And so part of it was actually honoring and turning towards the contraction and not just letting it take place, but actually finding a way to, the best metaphor is, instead of trying to cut the knot, breathe. And as you breathe, you feel the knot relax and untangle, or get, it's not so pressured, high pressured tension. And it's a muscle thing. It's a muscle, it's in your muscles. And I have to say that it's not just in the muscles below the neck. I had experience of dealing with the muscle in my head, of feeling the muscles or the tightness in my skull because of how contracted I was, because of not understanding how the intellect, in a way, my interpretive capacity was trying to resist what was happening in my interior. Thank you.
Yeah. I would like to take up this thing of Wendt, the issue of meaning. I didn't read his book, but from what you have said, Geoffrey, and from what I've read, as I understand it, he takes this, takes words as quanta and sentences and meanings as an entangled quantum system, as I understand it. And I'm not sure to interpret the reviews that I saw. And I find this very, very interesting, because there is in the science of, in the philosophy of consciousness, there is this problem which is called the binding problem. The binding problem is this problem where we see single words, and then suddenly, in a flash, we bind them together in a meaning. We do the same thing also visually. We look at the screen, we don't see the single pixel. Something in our consciousness almost instantly, well, not instant, probably it's about a tenth of a second, I don't know, binds all the pixels on the screen and suddenly sees something and associates to it a meaning. And so there is, in fact, an analogy also with quantum physics, where you have this idea where the quantum system, for example, there are the so-called Bose-Einstein condensates, which are systems of many, many particles, almost microscopic, macroscopic, or tenths of a millimeter, therefore quantum mechanically really huge, and yet they are in a coherent state. That is, you cannot describe them as made of many separable and individual particles, but you must describe it as a whole, single whole. But even the tiniest disturbance is sufficient to make it collapse into many, many particles. So there, I found this analogy of Wendt very, very interesting. I think, in fact, here we see an analogy. But we find these analogies also elsewhere. It's not only here, you find it also in ecology. Nowadays, we are becoming aware, having destroyed our environment, how everything is interconnected with everything. You cannot just say, okay, let's destroy this piece and without having consequences on the rest of the whole. Nowadays, we are discovering now, in the last years, I saw research how woods, forests work. They are not just a collection of trees. They are a single whole living being. And you cannot abstract from this wholeness if you want to understand really how a forest works. We have said that with the genome, with the genes, we thought of the genes as single atomic units of information which has a single function, and that's it. Nowadays we discover that they of course they have functions, but it's not just that. It's much more complicated, and system theory discovers that in the genome and also in other complex systems, how we must think as a collective whole and not as a system that must be separated into simple units. So my reflection is, why is it that we find this aspect in so many different contexts? Because if we would find this only in physics, I would say, okay, there is a justification to stick at the Newtonian reductionist Laplacian. Laplace was the first who came up with this idea that everything can be predicted if you know every atom where it is in space and time, and you know the interactions. You have a sufficiently big computer, you can calculate everything in the future. This is even not in principle. It's wrong even in principle. But why is it that we find this not only in physics, but also in biology, in ecology, in system theory, and in the science of language? So my instinct is to say, let's take entanglement seriously, not just to try to reduce it to something that satisfies our Newtonian, I would say even Aristotelian world conception. But that's very hard for most scientists. It's really hard because we are so accustomed to this reductionist point of view. And this has also good reasons, because it worked. It worked perfectly well. It had a gigantic success. We would not be here now and discuss about these things behind the screen, because all the technology is based on this paradigm. But this is only one aspect of reality. And that's, I think that is the next jump. It's from the social point of view, that's the jump that we have to make, and we have to reach. And shortly, last word about the interpretations that don't feel right. That's obviously connected. I don't feel them right to be right as well. And I take, after a long time that I was looking for the interpretation that fits better my own personal understanding, I gave up and I said, placed only a rule. I said I will only take seriously an interpretation which will no longer be not only an interpretation, but that makes also predictions. There's an interesting point about these interpretations. They describe very well everything that we already know, but they are not able to make much predictions. Well, that's not entirely true. There is also something, the interpretation of the quantum interpretation of the Gerardi-Rimini-Weber theory, which makes some predictions, and there are some experiments going on trying to test these, but it's very, very few, and they are extremely difficult to test these things. But 99% of the things that these interpretations tell us, that they tell us nothing new, and they don't predict something new. Relativity, quantum physics, also in biology, the new theories could also predict something, especially in physics, I would say. The special relativity is not just a theory that describes reality. It was able also to make predictions of phenomenon that we didn't know about, and they said, oh, relativity and quantum physics predicts this. Let's test this. Is it true? Yes, it turned out it is true. These interpretations are called interpretations because they interpret fine what we already know. But 99%, apart from few things that's another thing, but 99% of the things that they say, they don't predict nothing new. So I'm not even sure that they are theories, that they are. That's another point that makes me very skeptic about. So yes, so my message is that let's take entanglement as the message of nature, which tells us take wholeness, oneness seriously, and give up the old classical paradigm. And yes.
I'd love to jump in there. Thank you, Marco. And talking about entanglement, also Blake was talking about being and doing. Michael was talking about those neuromuscular locks, and we can have them in the head because there are lots of muscles in our heads. And how do we move from the lockdown in the cognitive and return to a kind of breath-based consciousness that can allow those neuromuscular locks to soften and relax, so that our cognition and our affective capacities function more effectively. Also, about the future, and is the future a mathematical one? Can be predicted by mathematics? This is a question I have, but I just wanted to backtrack a little bit because, not that we want to go into vent too much, but his basic insight happened in the shower. And he was imagining, he's a social scientist, he works in international relations. So he was in the shower and he had a fast forward. And the future, he believed, in that moment in the shower, would not be based upon the activities of anarchic states that can do whatever they want to their own people and do whatever they want outside of their own jurisdiction. He believes that something else will have happened. And I believe he speaks to this dilemma of where is the United States? Where is Germany? Where is Canada? Obviously, there's a boundary perhaps on a map that you could point to, but there's also the interior experience, Constitution of the United States, the separation of the president and the judicial branch and the Congress and the Senate, and those procedures. All of that, he claims, and I believe there's some value in this, is much more like an entangled system, as we who are here on this call, we have separate discrete bodies in different locations on the planet, but we're sharing a language. And the sharing of a language inevitably, he says, entangles our minds. So our minds are entangled. And this makes sense to me, partially. And I believe it also makes sense that we would be entertaining how a social scientist could be using quantum theory for his purposes, which is peace on earth. You know, and I think his wanting to disentangle from the classical is very much like trying to disentangle from the domination of the nation state. So also Doug mentioned, no, I'm sorry, it was Blake. Blake mentioned being and doing. And I believe that's a very fuzzy area. Our being and our doing is sometimes separated in very subtle ways. And I'm just reminded of another anecdote of a man on a subway platform in Manhattan. This is a very famous story. He was on the platform with his two children. One was a toddler, one was in a carriage. And he observed a man who was very disturbed, who had an epileptic fit, but he was he became normal again, and everyone thought he was fine. But unfortunately, as the train started to move into the station, the man had another fit, and he fell on top of the railroad track. So the man with the 2 children shouted, "Watch my kids." He jumped on top of the man's body on the railroad track, to everyone's horror, as the train came in. Everyone was very relieved. This is a very happy ending, that the man and the epileptic man both survived with only a few minor scratches. And of course, everyone was questioning the man, well, what were you thinking of when you made this decision? Which I would add, probably is not advantageous to his genes. There was his genetic inheritance was left on the platform. He also happened to be black, and the man he saved was white. So there may be another added confusion, since we're so dominated, it seems, by identity politics these days. But I think it raises that question, and it's one that Bateson raised, and so many of us are students of Bateson, is can the unconscious do the right thing? And I think this was an excellent example of, yes, the unconscious can, because the man who said he did this action, he did not do it because he thought about it. He wasn't thinking about anything at all. But I'm wondering, and I'm drawing upon some of the thinking of an ecologist, I can't remember his name right now. Oh, Tim Morton. He says if we're just going to leave this up to the unconscious, we're in real deep shit. He believes, and I hope that this is something that we can work on, that we can move towards becoming to have a capacity for consciously doing the right thing. And that's probably a very tall order. And I think it, will require a great deal of imagination. And so I'm curious about this wrestling with the imaginative, the imaginal aspects of our nature, the potential and the different kinds of logic that happen in the imaginal compared to what happens in the actual. When something gets concretized and actualized in our social worlds, we operate out of a very different kind of logic. So I'm bringing this up because we talked about it last time with Stuart Kaufman, a systems theorist, was trying to work out this coherence and decoherence and this collapse that happens, and that we may be, as Wynne says, walking wave functions, and that there is a different kind of logic, one that isn't based upon the laws of identity and the excluded middle. And I think that's another thing I just wanted to put on the table if any of you want to explore that. So thank you for this opportunity to rehearse these very difficult ideas. And I'm really grateful to everybody for making this happen. Thanks.
Marco, I have a question for you. Is the classical physics that tries to predict different from the quantum prediction that you were bringing? It seems like there's a shift in how we hold the nature of prediction between quantum and classical. Am I right, or am I totally off base?
No, they're very different.
So that's
Yes.
that's a difference, huh? How they hold the predicting.
Yes, but the interesting point is that we are speaking of a microphysical domain. Huh?
Yes.
Once you take a larger and larger and larger domain in spatial domain, let's take a spatial domain, or a larger collection of particles, then slowly but steadily it becomes classical. So it's, in a certain sense, it's both. At the macroscopic scale, we live and we perceive our classical world. At the microphysical scale, it's very different.
although there are
Yeah.
Provisos on that, right? So there are, like you mentioned, Bose-Einstein consciousness. So there are phenomena in the macro world that are that clearly exhibit quantum behavior. So this is the argument behind the idea that the brain or the mind and social systems and things like that can be quantum in nature. But the standard physicists say no, because there's this phenomenon called quantum decoherence. Now, I looked into this in preparation for this meeting because I think it's a key issue, and it is in a way related to your gut reaction, Michael, about entanglement seems to imply no separation, and that is not a comfortable proposition to deal with, right? We all need some separation, or we would fail to function as individuals, right?
Mhm.
So this idea of decoherence, originally, it was this idea that quantum collapse is fragile as a phenomenon, measurement, if you like, observation or interactions, and that there are so many interactions when you increase the number of particles that essentially any possibility of having coherent quantum effects at the macro level will be null. That was the original idea, but it shifted in the meantime. It shifted about 20 years ago when they first started looking at this, and they actually thought, not so much noise in the larger system that's the issue. It's the fact that originally they were looking at pure quantum systems, a pair of particles, with nothing else going on. But in fact, you can't ever do that. Any pair of particles are embedded in a larger system. And so the issue of decoherence is the relationship between the particular subsystem that you're looking at and the larger environment within which it sits. It's actually an ecological argument in the sense of what smaller systems inside larger systems.
Does that translate into Nora's trans-contextual?
No, not quite, but it's a
okay.
relationship between the two.
Okay.
Problem of let me finish the argument. The problem
Okay, I'm sorry.
of decoherence is when you embed a system of particles. So there's a technical issue. I'm not quite sure how it's an issue of degrees of freedom. The larger system have more degrees of freedom, and so the total number of available degrees of freedom goes up, and the density of degrees of freedom goes down. Anyway, it's a technical issue, but what it means is, to some extent, when you connect a smaller subsystem to a larger environment, things do dilute naturally. But at the same time, there can be mechanisms that stop the dilution, and this is what you get in these special cases. And so the argument about consciousness and quantum biology is that there are breaks to this decoherence going on. Now, where it gets tricky for me to understand, and I'm raising it more as a set of questions than a set of answers, is that, so the idea of decoherence is that, the fact that we observe classical physics around us. So therefore, scientists, physicists decided, well, there has to be a mechanism to turn down the quantum effects as you scale things up. And decoherence is the approach they came up with. But as Marco, you were just suggesting, we know that things are mixed up and entangled in the larger systems as well. And so the question I have about this is, to what extent are physicists being pulled by a particular paradigm to deal with certain kinds of decoherence, and not with other forms of decoherence, which have different properties that don't, if you're pulling towards the idea of things are one, and there's some barriers in there, because if everything was one, it wouldn't work. So you have to have these barriers in there. So you need a kind of world picture in which you have entanglement everywhere, but barriers everywhere as well. Instead of this idea that everything has to be classical and therefore your theories push quantum physics into a classical world, which I think is the wrong approach. I think this is the argument that we're making, is that there's a paradigm effect going on here, and that the way physicists are looking at this problem is wrong-headed, if not wrong exactly. But it needs to look at the scaling up in a different way. And one of the things that I notice, because I've been through 40 or 50 papers in the last few days looking at this issue of decoherence, is the way it actually is being discussed in the physics world looks more like this more complicated picture than the old picture. That is to say, I think there is an emerging out of the discussion about the decoherence a kind of much more complex understanding of decoherence as a kind of way of introducing some form of separation in a world that is fundamentally more entangled, rather than as everything is decohered so that there are no quantum effects at the macro scale, which doesn't seem to be right? So I'm just putting that out there as a kind of a reflection, argument, personal opinion in a way, compared to what is going on in the physics world.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I appreciate that articulation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the problem that you are hinting at is nowadays is still not there's still not an accepted solution to this. It is a discussion going on, because in fact we thought to have solved this problem, and in reality, looking at it more closely in the last years, we discovered that it is not really. It is the so-called measurement problem. In physics, it's called the measurement problem, which is a problem. Why don't we see in the macroscopic world these strange and weird phenomena, such as superposition, entanglement, or the cats, Schrödinger's cats that are dead and alive, etc.? Why don't we see them also in the macroscopic world as we see them in the microscopic world? It was thought that this could be explained away with just decoherence, and in fact, in part, you can explain it with decoherence, but it turns out that there are aspects that are still not clear. For example, in the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics, you can see that if you assume the coherence with the environment and with the measurement apparatus of a single elementary particle, very tiny microscopic particle, the mathematical structure that you have leads to contradictions. And it would need a mathematical discussion, but just to tell you that this tells you that since there is this mathematical contradiction, it tells you that probably we still did not really get to the bottom of the thing, and we still don't understand it. So decoherence alone is maybe one explanation, but probably there's more than that. And yes, now I wanted to say other things. I forgot. I should write them down. Well, okay, that's.
I'm just curious. You talked about the micro and the macro, and how we can, like Schrödinger's cat, that a cat can be alive and or dead. At the micro level, we can look at that, but at the macro, we can't. But what if some people can? What if people know, I better turn left rather than right? And they do so, and they discover that they were telepathically attuned to an accident that would have happened that didn't happen because they made that. Or just as that man who leaped off the platform to save a stranger from a train. Where did that come from, that capacity? So I'm suggesting that we probably, it's very hard to articulate this stuff because we're at that edge, you know, between these different dimensions. So, but I am suggesting that many human beings throughout history, through what we often call the imagination, are able to tune into different kinds of information than usually what the consensus reality around them will allow. So I think that there's, so the magical and the mythical aspects of our nature are still operating, but we are in a very strong, in many ways, defensive mental structure that dominates us. And I believe that those anomalies and splits that are happening in the paradigm is bringing forward a lot of weird stuff that we cannot explain. And I'm wondering about, is it a mechanism? As we, this entanglement and this collapse and the search for a mechanism. Well, mechanism seems to me to be we get measurements through instruments. And what kind of instruments are we going to be using to measure these imaginal and subtle, perhaps, what our previous history is called the imaginal, the subtle realms. And those of us who've studied Aurobindo together, we know a lot about this. So I think that's troubling to me because it seems like we're not going to have slide rulers or compasses or, you know, what are the instruments of measurement? And it seems to me we're going to have to use, you know, our consciousness itself is going to be having to come into the foreground in a way perhaps it hasn't been forced to do before. So I think that's why we're having all these conversations about what the hell is consciousness. And I think we've tried to sweep this under the rug because it's so difficult, because we don't have any way of measuring it. So any responses to that, I'd love to hear. I know our time is almost running out though.
I have a couple of things and I'll say them quickly and then Marco can chime in maybe if he has a different thing. Now, there's a couple of things going on there. Well, I'll try to do with the second one first. So it feels like entanglement should be an explanation for those things. And it may be an explanation for some of those things. But there's a problem with entanglement. And that is, it can't be used to transfer information. And this is proven. This is not just a theory, it's proven. You cannot use entangled states to transfer information from one location to the other across the entanglement. Now, it sounds like a contradiction in terms because we've been saying all along that you change the particle state of this thing and it automatically changes the particle state on the other one. So why can't I use that to transmit a message? Well, the problem is that you're not actually inferring from the location of one particle and its inverse. You're actually looking at a collection of particles over here and a collection of particles over here. And the correlations are between even though you can look at individual particles, the effect is an effect of collections. And the way the statistics of these probabilities work is you can't actually send a message. There's not enough information that you could actually transmit a message from one location to the other via the entanglement. And so you can't You can't use it as a way of communicating information. And this seems to be built into the way entanglement works. So what does that mean? What the hell is entanglement if it's not information, right? And that's where we step off the deep end. Nobody knows really what entangle actually means in terms of systems and how they interact, right? So because it's not about information conversion. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there isn't a quantum physical explanation for those kinds of effects. It's just that we have no idea what it is, if there is one, right? And I've been thinking about that to some extent, because I think in a way, like it's used in a different way. There's an argument, it's called the universal censorship argument. It's actually used in the context of black holes, which is a very different context. But the idea is the universe conspires to make certain things possible and certain things impossible. And the idea of faster than light communication, which is essentially what entanglement would allow, if it allowed the communication of messages, is something that the universe conspires to prevent happening. So that's a kind of an argument against it, but you could use the argument, I think, in an inverted way. So, for instance, I think about dreams, like you have a very vivid dream life, Johnny. And now dreams are interesting because they're hard to extract direct information from. They tell us some collection of things about our experiences, but they don't actually tell us something. We can actually point a finger and say, that means this. We can guess, but we can't actually know based on dreams. And so maybe dreams could follow from entanglement, because you can't actually guess. You can't actually, if you're following the argument, the universe conspires against knowledge transmitting faster than the speed of light. You could still argue that dreams allow you to get something out of that, So it's a thought experiment that I'm indulging in order to suggest that, because of course there's no evidence for it. But so I'm not sure if Marco, if you had some other.
Yeah. I like this idea with the dreams. I would like also to report about a similar experience in a waking state. But first, I would like to offer another perspective on this problem that information cannot be transmitted because of due to entanglement. That's true. That's correct. I offer a slightly different perspective. It's true that we cannot transmit. In quantum mechanics, you have Bob and Alice, so two persons, two human beings who try to communicate by using entangled particles on one side of the universe and on another side of the universe, instantly messages. And usually, that's impossible. Bob and Alice cannot transmit their messages. That is, they cannot transmit their ideas from their brain, acting on some machine, which transmits through entangled particles instantly information to the other part. So, and it is easy to understand why this is, because we should not forget that what determines which particle has spin up and spin down, let's take the example of the spins that I made at the beginning, it's not us in any case. Also, the particle that I measure in my laboratory, if it turns out to be a spin up, it is because it is so. It's just random. It is not decided by me. And also Bob, who is on the other side of the universe, will get instantly the opposite spin, but nothing in his laboratory or even nothing decides which of the two outcomes will be the next. Who is deciding, so to speak? not the human experimenters, but it is nature. Nature as a whole says, now Bob gets a spin up and Alice a spin down. Now the next time Alice will get the spin up and Bob the spin down, and so on. So there is not a transmission of information between two individuals, but we can still conceive of a sort of cosmic consciousness, if you would like to call it whatever you want, that has a consciousness and makes a conscious choice to say that spin, that particle will turn out there with that spin and that other with the opposite spin. And the next time, the contrary. So, and what appears to us to be random, maybe it's not really random. Who knows? Okay, that's my speculation. But I'm just trying to give a different perspective on this, in the sense that I say we cannot transmit information due to entanglement individually, but that does not mean that there is a conscious choice from something that is not an individual, but is a whole as such. And because random is just a word that tells something about our ignorance. It's nothing more than that. Randomness is not something that tells us about final causes. As to the fact of the dreams and the mind, I think yes. In fact, our minds probably are interconnected and are just receiving stations inside this whole, and we probably, most of the things that we think probably are not our stuff, but come from the outside, and that's not I can explain, for example, an experience that I had, well, what is it now, a couple of weeks, 10 days ago. I was driving my car and was going to Italy on these German highways full queues, and so you must be patient and relax, otherwise you get very, very nervous, and so you must accept, as Michael said also, this was a psychological pain. Just open to it and accept it as it is. And if you are, sometimes you get in a sort of transcendent state where suddenly an idea came to my mind, an idea, and which was also a feeling, which said, it's time for a new shooting. So I need that there be a new shooting and people. So, I mean, the shooting, you know, in schools or the restaurants. And I was almost shocked because it was not just a remembrance of the shootings that we already have seen so many, but there was this desire of a new shooting. And I said, well, I was shocked because I said, this is something coming up from my subconscious somehow. What is this perversion? Something perverted, really. And I said, very strange. Then, after, I don't know, a few hours, I turned on the radio and I heard about the shootings in Mexico, and then shortly later in Dayton. The skeptic would say, well, would take a rational approach and say, how many people would probably think about shootings just a few hours before a shooting arises? And would say, well, it's just a coincidence. I don't think so, because it was really not just an idea, it was a feeling, something evil, by the way, something that desired this. And only later I understood that I have intercepted something from an atmosphere, that something that has a whole atmosphere on Earth, something damp and negative perhaps, There are also nice things earthly, but this was something, and I believe, I would not tell this to physicists because I cannot make an experiment of this, but I believe that there is in fact this sort of whole on mental consciousness, earthly consciousness on different levels, and also very subconscious and very negative, which connects each other, and we are able to intercept this. And this is reminds me very much of quantum entanglement and phenomena, where in fact you have two particles that you can imagine them as one and a single object without differentiations, and suddenly collapses in two particles or more particles. You can see also with one particle. Just let one particle go through one slit, it diffracts, but it hits only one point on the screen. So you have first the wave, and then it collapses. It is very reminiscent, these mechanisms. It's like a wave on the whole mental atmosphere of Earth, and it collapses somewhere, and you intercept this idea. As to the question of John, if we can have machines that measure this, I would love that. But there comes a skeptic. I say, yeah, that's wonderful things, analogies. And these are subjective experiences. But when it comes to show them empirically with experiments in the laboratory, I have not the slightest idea how to do that.
Right, and I think the field of parapsychology is very, very complex for that very reason, because many of these telepathic or out-of-body experiences or lucid dreams can be cultivated, the capacity, but not controlled. Except maybe very, very rare people can do that. But we are maybe starting to create some laboratory conditions where things that were considered woo-woo and way out there are no longer, like lucid dreaming, which was, when I was growing up, impossible. Even though I had lucid dreams all the time, it wasn't until the 90s that Stephen LaBerge actually created an experiment so it could be tested and verified in laboratories around the world. So now we all know, yeah, lucid dreaming is real. It's not just, some weird people who have these fantasies. So anyway, I'm just sharing that because I think also Blake has been making some really interesting comments on chat, and usually most people don't use chat here, Blake. You're welcome to do that. You can just chime in whenever you want to, I would love to hear your comments, and rather than read it on chat, just put it out into the space and we'll work on it because the comments look very interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. Sometimes it's easier for me to comment on chat. There's background noise here and my internet connection's not that good. So, and also it leaves a little bit of a record, allows other people to, I guess for some it's a bit distracting as a side conversation, but I sometimes find it to be a helpful tool. It keeps like a thread going that connects to what people are saying. For me anyway, this latter part of the conversation has really been fascinating.
Although we do record the sessions and it goes on YouTube, Blake. So, and in fact, the chat won't show up on YouTube. So in fact, it's better to say the things than to chat if you want it to go into the record. But,
yeah, and also it gives us it contributes to our discussion considerably to hear your voice and your face and whatever comes through. I think it really helps ground our conversation. So please feel free to do that, Blake. Thank you.
And I think there's a suggestion, I think you're making a suggestion that we do a second session on the issues related between quantum theory, quantum ideas, and maybe we've lost Blake, but and spirituality, which I think would be a great idea. So we can maybe organize another exchange, because we really started to only get into these issues in sort of the last 5 to 10 minutes of the call, which is normal because we had a lot of ground to cover beforehand to get there. But maybe a second session makes sense to sort of delve into this a little bit deeper. I think it does respond to the interest of several people around the virtual table, as it were. I wanted to come back just quickly on something that Marco said about this, about who decides up versus down in this. You know, this is actually, I think it's a point that Wendt makes in his book, that in the original definitions or descriptions of wave collapse that Schrödinger made, this was left ambiguous. Physicists interpret his remarks as being randomness, but that's not what he actually said. I can't remember what he said, but it was something about some determination is made by agent or nature or something, and random is what people have assumed. But I think it's another gap in the understanding, and there is an opening there for it to be a larger entangled whole that speaks through that gap, right? So. Oh, and the final thing, the second thing I wanted to say that I'd forgotten earlier about your comments was about measurement. So there is still a controversy about, Marco referred to it just to a small extent, but what exactly is causing wave collapse? If you believe in wave collapse, not everybody does, but because some of these other interpretations do not require it. But if you have wave collapse, is a measurement some instrument that measures? Does it require consciousness to be involved? Or is it simply interaction between particles? Different physicists deal with all three of those cases in different papers. It's like they don't agree with each other about them. So there's still a lot of uncertainty about what exactly a measurement is and how it's used, right? So.
Yeah, this makes also part of the measurement problem. It's also this, yes, the part of the problem. Yeah, that's sure. It's returning back. We thought to understand it, but now many physicists believe that it's already solved by the coherence and don't even question what the measurement means, because at fundamental level, also two particles hitting each other can be considered a measurement, but they may be also entangled. So it's not clear. But the last point I would like to just to perhaps as a proposal, so for the next session, if there's some, the notion of randomness, it is something that we rarely question about. What is randomness? When we think about randomness, the physicists, at least in quantum physics, just take it as a granted, obvious notion and don't think about the philosophical implications, which is that randomness unconsciously suggests us something that is without causes, without a final cause, without finality. That this is just happens by random. There's no meaning in it. Randomness as such tells us nothing about meaning, causality, causalities, finality, or something like that. If you take an encrypted message and you look the encrypted message that we use to make credit cards, payments, and so on, if you look at the stream of bits, they're completely, almost perfectly random. And yet there is contained a very precise meaning, a final agent, an agent which writes these messages not just by random, but it has been translated in such a way that it appears random. So that in quantum mechanics, people speak of real randomness and indeterministic randomness. But no, when you think about these in philosophical terms, you discover that they are very random concepts. And we don't know really what we are talking about when we speak about randomness in quantum mechanics, I believe.
So,
Okay.
so basically, we're trying to exclude us from participating.
Yeah, yeah, that could be could be a good.
I mean, that's what
good point of view. I never
that's
thought
the
about that.
sense
Yeah.
I got, is that
Yeah.
we're basically trying to exclude. I mean, we're doing all this, but we're not acknowledging however subtle, we're still participating. But I mean, the image I have is, and I'm pardon if I offend anybody, but how do you kill a deer from a distance with a gun? I mean, that's a gut feeling as far as how this lack of participation feels with me in science in some ways. The way science has been taught to me affects me that way, if I can say it that way.
But Wendt, for instance, makes an argument about this, the collapse, that it's actually the moment in consciousness where decisions are made are those collapses, which is also an interesting perspective, and not inconsistent with the arguments we were making, you know, about a larger consciousness and so forth. But so it's not necessarily excluded. That's very inclusive of us, as opposed to.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it was just I like Marco using. My ideas have feelings around them. Like when he said that, I really resonated with that idea of feeling.
Just briefly, I wanted to respond because I think there's something about the mental structure, especially, I'm drawing on Gebser here and anyone could correct me, but the mental structure, especially in its deficient forms, want to eliminate as much as possible the human so we can keep it in the range of mathematical prediction and control. And that's my question I had earlier, is can the future be determined by mathematics? And I think, though, that as we're moving into perhaps a new age, that those anomalies, the telepathic experiences, the experience of evil, and out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences and all kinds of paranormal events and the very weird, there's just too much of it, too much evidence of it to be ignored or trivialized. And I think a healthy mental structure, and I think a lot of people, we all love and should appreciate the benefits of the mental structure, but we also need to recognize it has its limits. And what happens next is probably what we're all trying to create the conditions for. So I think that's really interesting observation that you made, Michael, about how this tendency to want to eliminate our subjective experience is very, very strong in the deficient mental. And for good reasons. There have been turf wars between science and religion that run very, very deep in our psyche. And so for certain kinds of science to develop, there had to be this schism in our history. I believe we have to correct that very quickly, though, because we need to, and I think we're recognizing these mysterious and intersubjective and affective zones. The mental structure is riding upon those capacities. And so the mental structure actually collapses without those capacities. So I think this is what we're starting to appreciate in some of the discourse events that we've arranged here. And I hope Blake and Jeffrey and everyone participating on this call can work in the forum about how we could create a follow-up to this session. And we've already had a lot of previous episodes on physics and quantum physics, and maybe we can bring in biology as well. I think it's has been neglected by us, because I think there's a great deal of interest in biosemiotics and what's happening at the cellular level. There's a whole lot of interesting philosophy going on around biology right now. So, and I think this all contributes to many of our spiritual aspirations here. So thank you all. I hope this happens in the, if not the next Café or soon after that, we can make this happen. Thanks.
I just want to nuance my point of view is that from my trauma and recovery and healing, I actually had to dismantle, be in the place of dismantling the way I participate with not just my trauma, but the way my trauma was causing me to participate, of overreactivity, of doing, and the mental rational, poor mental rational, or the deficient rational being at odds with my inner experience. And so I was, I'm going to say it this way, John, because it feels like this. It was the fucking most intense liminal space I've ever lived in. But I had to literally participate with both sides that were at war with each other, if that makes sense.
I'm sorry, I have so much to say about these things, but we didn't get into the causality issue, which Marco raised, because quantum entanglement, especially the temporal aspects of it, murky the waters about causality in ways that are not understood at this point. Even, you know, I mean, the fact that you can't communicate a message is one thing. It doesn't mean to say there aren't consequences in time of the fact that that the quantum world is not local temporally, as we have always assumed. So maybe this will come back into the spiritual discussion as well, because I think it also has influence on the spiritual questions. So I definitely think it would be interesting to, I'm sorry, I keep trotting out new stuff.
That's good. That's good. Maybe we can, I know Doug isn't here today, as he usually is. I know he's taken some time off, so we may have to pitch in if we want to coordinate a future event while he's on vacation. So maybe we can do this in the forum and try to, you know, pool our resources here so we can frame another event in a way that would satisfy our curiosity and bring in these new ideas. Thanks.
Very enlivening conversation, everybody. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you all, and welcome, Blake. Thank you for your participation. I hope you'll return.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ed, you didn't say a lot, but
I said I came to listen.
That you did, Ed. That you did.
I did.
Thank you all.
Very, very helpful. Very helpful. Yeah.
Have a beautiful weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.
and we will
Bye-bye.
follow up. Thanks for everybody for coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Sounds good to me.